Hello, and welcome to another episode of Solipsist Watched, where this week I watched Roadhouse from 2024. Now, if you've been around here a little bit, you'll know that the reason I watched this is because I watched the first one. A movie that admittedly, in retrospect, I didn't have a lot of positive things to say about. And yet, somehow, here and now, I am about to pay the original Roadhouse a bunch of compliments because this movie's worse. Now, I didn't have high expectations for this by any means, and I'm really doing this for the bit more than anything. But I was not kind of prepared for what exactly this movie is and all the ways it would fail to live up to the very low bars set by its predecessor. I believe there's also a sequel to the original Roadhouse that was made somewhere in between these two, but I don't know anything about that. So that's a side thing. This is alleged to be a remake of the original Roadhouse, and it is not. I mean, the character isn't even named the same. It's not even the same character. This is Elwood Dalton, and I believe in the first movie it is James Dalton, and we're gonna get into it. This is a real mess of a movie, but I have to admit up front, it's not horribly offensive. It's not like the worst thing I've ever watched or anything like that. And after saying that it's worse than the original Roadhouse, a movie I was not charitable about, really makes it sound like it should be atrocious. But it's really just very bland and does most of the things it sets out to do not very well. And it's also put into perspective some of the things that work in the first movie in context, but do not work anymore, in not just in this movie, but in general. Because when we talked about Roadhouse, the original, I think I talked about how it's not really a movie you could make in the current era. It's very dated in a lot of ways. It's a lot of extreme violence and, well, it's not even that extreme, but it's just a lot of violence and overt sexuality, toplessness, etc. And it's mostly a spectacle movie, I think, for the kind of person. I'm trying not to be too rude here, but the kind of individual who, dude bros, basically, who don't really care about substance that much. They mostly want to see some people get punched and then other people get sexed, and that's about it. And that's fine. There's a time and place for that. And certainly in the 80s, there was a lot of time and place for that because people were making those kinds of movies all over the place. It's just that a lot of them were small releases or straight to VHS. Roadhouse just happened to come out in full. But anyway, coming back to this movie, this is a movie that is trying to pretty closely follow the original, and somehow forgot that a bunch of the content that was in the original either can't be made anymore or doesn't make sense anymore, or like is just culturally and thematically inappropriate in the current era. I think the first thing that stuck out to me is that this is not a Roadhouse. I don't know if people know what a Roadhouse is, including the writers of this movie, because the first movie was a Roadhouse. This is not a Roadhouse. A Roadhouse is a term that goes back long time, and basically refers to a location in the middle of nowhere that usually on a long road or trail where people could stop and have food and drinks, etc., as they were on a long distance trek of one kind or another. There's like, obviously this extends to various eras. This is the pre-car era, it's the post-car era. In the 89 version of this movie, it's like, it's sort of the type of thing that's it's the idea of the air quotes new version of a roadhouse, that being a bar, or kind of a rough bar that's kind of in the middle of nowhere, probably populated by some of the locals of a very small town, and then a bunch of people who are passing through, either who are truckers or people on trips or whatever, that sort of thing. And that was a thing that existed a lot more back then than it does now, for a bunch of reasons. So they've moved the setting from, in the original, being this place in the middle of the nowhere on what's very clearly, from the framing of that movie, a long strip of like dusty road, to the middle of the Florida fucking Keys, a place that basically exists purely on tourism, a place that they show from the very start people are driving down constantly. This is not what a roadhouse is. This is not what attracts that kind of clientele. And I'm not saying there isn't a bit of a pivot here that does sort of work theoretically, because they try and reframe it as the same sort of thing of, instead of it being a small town where, one guy has basically taken everything over and paid for everything and then exerts his power over the entire small town because he can. It's now they pivot to, it's this family that wants to develop some land in the Keys because that family was also directly involved in the drug trade, et cetera, et cetera. Except for then they drop that storyline basically immediately, and because they say, oh, well, what happened in the past doesn't actually matter. They're actually just super mad because they can't get the land rights. And it's very silly. But then it also draws into question why the bar is the way it is, because they copy a bunch of stuff from the original movie, the type of stuff like the chicken wire over the stage so that people throw bottles and they can't, the glass doesn't go through and stuff like that. And the general clientele of this place that looks like, it's basically an open air bar. It's like this A-frame building, very, very like Key West style out of, I'm actually surprised. Well, I won't say anything that would spoil anything. But they like, this doesn't look like a roadhouse. A roadhouse is a shack on the side of the road. This is a fancy-ish open-air bar that is pretending to be a roadhouse. Where did these people come from? Like, where are these rough, all these rough people coming from? They don't seem to be coming from the local community, or at least the local community that we see outside of the roadhouse doesn't act anything like that. So is it just, what's the reasoning for this clientele? It's the only roadhouse here, so it's not like this is the local bar. This isn't a roadhouse. It's just weird. So that was the one that set me off on this in the first place, but especially upon reflection of the first movie, which I heavily criticized for its very, even for the time, inappropriate, but its general treatment of women and the way that, like, I mean, it's both dude bro cinema and cinema in general and the 80s in general, like attitudes towards women as objects and damsels in distress and that sort of thing. And so they try and do a lot of the same plot beats in this movie, and it doesn't work because they have a more progressive view, which is good. That there isn't a scene in this movie where some guy offers another guy the chance to squeeze his, partner's boobs or whatever. I'm glad they didn't recreate that scene or a bunch of the other scenes, because that was inappropriate. It's intentional in that movie. But you obviously can't do that anymore, and that's a good thing. But then what are you going to replace it with? Because a lot of that was supposed to draw upon like the character of the place, that like, oh, everybody here is a scumbag, everybody's doing something shady, everybody's mistreating somebody, etc., etc. It gives character to the location. It's not great characterization, but it's meaningful in terms of setting the stage for everything else that's going to revolve in the like arc of the plot. And instead, what you get in this film is just a movie that basically skips all that, and so instead says Elwood gets hired because there are some mean people coming to this bar. That's the setup. It's just like, oh, this is an otherwise really nice bar, except for these guys who come over and are bullies. And then he's there, one day, and then it obviously it all unfolds from there. But just the setup doesn't make sense, and it doesn't give the same opportunity for character building or plot arc building as a result. So we don't have the same, like, they attempt to have a romantic interest, same as the first film, which fizzles because she doesn't really have anything to do anymore, because she's not, looking longingly at Dalton anymore, because it's no longer thematically appropriate in this version of the film, but it was in the first one. And they aren't having extended sex scenes in this movie, because that's no longer a thing we really do anymore, especially in a scenario like this, because it's a pretty antiquated view, and it's a very objectifying way to portray women in general. So, like, since they can't make the female love interest a sex object anymore, she just has nothing to do for the most part. She occasionally comes in as she occasionally has a random tie into the story when the plot needs a character to have a connection or be at a place at a time, and that's about it. And that, I say that especially because that's not the only character for whom that is true. Pretty much the whole cast ends up like that at some point. It pretty much devolves to Dalton versus a big gang of different levels of guys, and it gets muddled, and everybody who's attached to Dalton, which is sort of the appeal of the first movie, is that Dalton and everybody else who works at the Roadhouse and stuff start to have camaraderie and rapport, and they cheer for each other, they support each other, etc. It's not very deep, but it's more than you get here, because they have nothing to do. And so instead, to fill time, they complicate the story. They add more events, more people, more factions that are all not serving the main story. Like, I don't even know what even is the main story at all in this film, to be honest. Because the original movie is very focused in a way, because it's basically just two locations, or maybe three. It's the Roadhouse, it's the home that Dalton lives in, or the barn that Dalton lives in that movie, and the mansion across the river or across the pond or whatever, and then the occasional scene of a location in town. It's very focused in what it's doing. This one starts to, like, especially in the second half, really shows off who it's trying to appeal to, because it keeps expanding the scope. It's adding new people. They're going on, excursions away from the roadhouse and the immediate area where they live and work. It's doing all of these other things. But I'm actually, well, we'll loop back around in a minute. And so that is really what solidifies to me the narrative problem here of you just tried to fill time with more action, and you didn't make it more compelling. You just made it kind of longer. I think I've mentioned before that one of the most, I'm sure I've said it in various capacities, the most grievous sin that a movie can be is boring, and the most grievous sin an action movie can be is to have the action be the most boring part of the film. And this movie has incredibly dull action. It's not the worst. It's not horribly chopped up. It's actually occasionally pretty well choreographed, but that's kind of the problem, is it is too well choreographed. There is a certain historical appeal to the original Roadhouse because it came out right at the tail end of sort of a certain era of action films, especially, schlocky, low budget action films, where it was a lot of guys who had learned a small amount of a couple of martial arts and could throw together enough of a choreography to not look totally stilted, right? To look, maybe if you knew a little bit about fighting, that you'd think these guys are pretty dumb, but that it was at least good enough to be aesthetically appealing. And we've talked before about how some of the cross influences between sort of Hong Kong martial arts films and how that was imported into Hollywood and then exported back to Hong Kong in various ways, and how there's been cross influences there. And so the original Roadhouse has some of that same, like, Patrick Swayze, like so many other leading men of that time, had a certain, like, I'll take my shirt off and do some martial arts for a little bit, and or some boxing or whatever, and that's the action. And not to give too many accolades, but at least at that time, a lot of those leading guys actually knew those martial arts enough, at least enough to actually do them on screen and not have stunt doubles or worse. We'll get to that too. But this movie instead has these heavily choreographed fight scenes with the camera just all over the place. Maybe it's just an aesthetic choice that I don't particularly like, but the camera in this movie is constantly swinging in circles. And it's trying to circle fights as they happen. It's really taking advantage of all of the modern technologies used for camera rigging and camera motion that were not available at the time. And in addition to that, it's also using digital compositing. So it can do things that are impossible to do actually in camera. But we'll put a pin in that as well. So this really gets to the worst of it because they have... I guess this is a spoiler. If you don't want a spoiler for an actor who shows up about midway through, then fine. But honestly, you already know. If you watch the first one, you already know the plot. I'm really not spoiling a whole lot. I'm not going to spoil the actual things that happen. So they hired Conor McGregor, who is a very famous UFC fighter and notorious asshole, to be sort of a co-star, well, not a co-star, but a supporting villain in this film. And he is just one of several problems with how this movie tries to spread out its villains, spread out the evil, so that Jake Gyllenhaal as Elwood Dalton has things to do and people to fight, basically people to punch. So now we wrap back around to the beginning, where they have recontextualized this movie while trying to remake the original again. And Dalton in this movie is a former UFC fighter. Not a former MMA fighter, a former UFC fighter specifically. Because this whole fucking movie is one big advertisement for the UFC. And I am very willing to bet, well, it's an Amazon production, so I'm sure. Actually, I don't know who owns the UFC. Maybe Amazon and MGM own the UFC for all I know. Anyway, I'm sure they've got lots of cross promotion and stuff going on regardless. UFC features heavily in this movie. So Dalton, both in reality and in sort of metatextual ways, because Conor McGregor, UFC fighter, one of the biggest names out there, and then Dalton as the character is a UFC fighter who, I guess they're saying, killed a guy in the ring because he got too angry. I'm gonna be real with you. I don't know what to do with that. Because in the original film, it's Patrick Swayze killed a guy in a bar in self-defense, allegedly, but he like ripped the guy's throat out, and that was like super brutal, blah, blah, you know. And so he's sort of haunted by that. Weirdly enough, the problem in the first film with that is that it doesn't entirely make sense why he's so upset by that. Because he's clearly willing to dole out violence and has an understanding of what that violence can result in. So that doesn't totally make sense. It's really just a setup for a payoff late in the film that I don't even know what the intention is there, honestly. It's just a subplot for no particular reason to give him his one and only weakness. And then they reflect that in this film, where this version of Dalton killed apparently his friend. They tell us it's all exposition. They do some flashbacks and stuff that are done pretty. They are done badly, if I'm honest. Like, they feel bad to me. It's very apparent that they put a lot of effort into them, in the sense that they got Jake Gyllenhaal to walk out during an actual UFC match, so they could get that like footage for real, for the realism of fighting in the UFC. But you know, it's not done well. It's not done aesthetically well or narratively well. It's just sort of a very heavy-handed way to pad the time with more violence. And that really leads us to the problem of the difference between the characters. But maybe we'll get to that in a second. Because what I wanted to say about the UFC being heavily featured is that really is what sort of put this whole thing together for me, for who's the target audience and what is that target audience theoretically expecting. Don't take this the wrong way if you're one of these people, I guess, but I don't know how you found my videos if you are. The type of dude who just watches the UFC all the time, there is an archetype to that kind of person that I do not expect to cross over a lot with the type who cares a lot about literature and narrative storytelling and cinematic finesse or subtlety or for that matter, respecting women, but weirdly they avoid that in this context. But this movie really ends up reading like an ad for the UFC and an excuse for to make Jake Gyllenhaal the baddest dude who can punch the hardest while keeping calm. The movie. That's basically the movie. Man holds down his anger and punches people, and also does some MMA stuff as well. And that kind of doesn't work for the rest of the narrative, because he's then ending up on this like greater crusade for something that doesn't really seem to resonate with his character at all. There are a few moments that are slightly convincing to me of like, oh yeah, he does seem like he would care about this. But ultimately, I don't know. Jake Gyllenhaal is a good actor, but this is a weird role that I haven't entirely been able to parse all the little places that it's wrong. Because they do things to set him up for caring about the location, about the roadhouse, about the people, about these other things that happen. There's a lot of the same plot beats from the original movie. But he never comes off like the original Dalton as the same sort of like crusader for justice and manners and cleaning up the place. He's more of an incidental, really, in his own story. Like I said, he gets invited down in the first place because, I don't know, there were some bad dudes at this one bar, and I guess that should be it, the end of it, once they're gone, because this isn't a real roadhouse. But they still do all the same setup beats that no longer work in context for me. It's enough that if you don't really care about the narrative that much and mostly want an excuse to get to the next fight scene, then it's good enough, I guess. But it just doesn't work for me. So let's talk about the character comparison for a second here then. The Patrick Swayze as Dalton is very much sort of this like stoic, like he's very stoic in a lot of ways. He doesn't really get emotionally invested in a lot of things as he's known for. He's very professional, and the main reason that he's there in the framing of the film and the most of his direct actions are about getting the roadhouse itself whipped into shape. It's not just about let's get the bad guys out. It's let's get everybody who works at the roadhouse to understand what we're doing here, to get trained better, to have a better situation here so that we can improve the roadhouse so that it can be actually of value to something and a place some people would actually want to go. That's not, again, really even possible in this film. So our version of Dalton instead is just sort of, I don't want to be disrespectful because he's got reasonable PTSD and reason to grieve and all that, but he's just kind of a depressed guy. Like, he's just kind of a depressed guy who happens to be really good at fighting and mostly doesn't react to people, but he doesn't even really come off as stoic. He's more quippy, more just blasé about everything that's happening, rather than Swayze, who comes off more sort of almost calculating in his subtlety. Weird to call Swayze subtle, but here we are. And Swayze is also, like, with Swayze's comparative emotional distance from everyone and everything, including his own love interest a lot of the time, Gyllenhaal can't help but come off much more sort of friendly He's still distant. He's still like emotionally not entirely there and clearly dealing with stuff, but some combination of the writing and Gyllenhaal himself, both his acting and his frankly his face, is hard not to have him come off kind of chummy. Gyllenhaal naturally has a very smiley face when he talks. And so when he actually does get into conversation with people, the idea of him being this like stoic, depressed guy kind of doesn't hit anymore. He instead just seems like, I don't know. His actions don't match his words, is I guess what I'm trying to say. His actions are to mope around and pretend like he doesn't care about anything and doesn't want to be here, but his words say, I want to be friends with everybody here. Or the subtext of his facial acting when he is speaking and talking to people, etc. And so there's a couple of weird scenes where they have to kind of overtly remind us with dialogue from him where he's like, I'm a bad guy, you don't want to be around me, which nobody believes, which really increases how flat that falls when literally everybody he says to is like, I don't care, man, whatever. I still think you're cool or a good person or hot or whatever the relevant thing is in that particular scene. And so he's a very ill-defined character other than just guy who punched good. And so his narrative arc doesn't really unfold at all. Meanwhile, like I said, all of his allies have basically zero definition and exist only to fulfill narrative purpose. And then he has to just fight a ton of people because that's the thing to do, because he's the good guy and they're the bad guys. Yeah, that about sums it up. And it gets progressively more bombastic and over the top and very 2010s, 2020s Hollywood action crap, escalating the stakes over and over in ways that are just plain unnecessary other than for the visual spectacle of the thing. Until the final fight, which is just the dumbest shit. It's such a shame because, especially in going back to it, the final encounter in the original Roadhouse is so good in the cheesiest way. Like it's very stupid, but it's that moment where I finally thought the movie actually understood itself because it finally gave into the cheese. And instead, it's just, and this is the ultimate confrontation of UFC fighters. And it's like, I didn't come to the cinema to watch a UFC match be filmed poorly. I didn't go to the cinema at all, obviously, but the point is there. And then to add insult to injury for that one particular scene especially, but the whole movie in general, I was noticing some very cheap looking CGI. I don't know why they did this. They could have just omitted those scenes or done them practically or not done them at all. But there is a lot of use of CGI in this film, and it all looks borderline cartoonish. The physics are always wrong. It's the kind of stuff that is, you remember when the Marvel movies were coming out, some of the early ones, and they hadn't quite nailed down some of the CGI. And so the physics on characters and the way they flipped and bent and stuff like that looked a little bit weird. They just didn't seem to have the weight or motion that they should. That's what all of the CGI looks like in this movie. both for people and for like objects that are interacted with. And this is really just the most egregious when the whole thing has been basically an ad for the UFC, and this spectacle, including an actual very famous UFC fighter, and they get to the end, and the final like who's gonna be the biggest punch guy comes down to what looks to me like a probably 60% CGI fight. Not even, body doubles or anything, just straight heavy use of CGI editing, digital compositing of either full CGI or digital compositing, depending on the shot. And, they merge stuff so it all looks seamless, which is, again, impossible within the camera. And it just looks bad. Everything's fuzzy. Everybody's bendy. I even forgot. There's so many little things wrong with this film. I'm sure I'm going to forget a bunch of them because I don't write notes for these generally. The audio editing is so bad. The stock sound effects, the like borderline. I don't think they're actually free sound libraries, but the sound libraries where the sound effects are so commonly used that you're like, I know that's not that sound. You didn't even get a Foley artist. You just used a sound library for this Hollywood film. Well, actually, I think it got a very limited release. But anyway, this has a bunch of Hollywood actors in it, and you're using stock sound effects. Come on, man. Like for punch noises and glass breaking and door opening and wood crunching, like this is what you did with that. I would love to know from the type of dude bro UFC fighter fighting lover that this is targeted at, I think this is so bad that even they will not appreciate what's been done here. I think it's that poorly executed that it's just, I don't think even those people will like it. Let's talk some of the technical stuff just to wrap this up. I already mentioned a lot of the audio is real bad. The visual is also real bad in a lot of ways. It's, again, not the worst. They don't do constant, well, maybe this is the new thing. They don't do the constant cuts during fight scenes that we've seen for like the last 2 decades, especially, where they're constantly either changing angles or chopping up the action to make it look faster, or to hide errors in the choreography, or the fact that the choreography is being done by stunt people or whatever. Instead, there's a lot less of that in this movie, and again, probably partially reliant on CGI. They are instead just fake. It's fake camera motion. It's camera shots that are digitally edited together without a cut, but that a lot of the time just can't be possible. And that's on top of the fact that this movie is ugly for the most part. Like, the lighting is just terrible. The lighting and color grading in almost every shot of this movie is off color and dim and dingy. And when it isn't, it's even more jarring, hilariously. In the couple of scenes where they fix the brightness, it's just like, this is weirdly bright for the rest of this movie, because clearly they didn't have a consistent visual aesthetic planned for this, other than what do we do for all of these movies at the end of them. I guess I already talked about the acting to some extent. Jake Gyllenhaal, I want to be clear that my criticisms of Gyllenhaal's performance, I don't think are his fault. It's some combination of the questionable writing and very poor direction that's being done for this film. Who's this? It's directed by Doug Liman, who I can't remember. I know that name, but I can't remember what from. Yeah, it's just really rough all around, and doesn't seem to capture even the idea of the original. It's just a sloppy mess. I can't even say that I want the same things out of this as I wanted from the first one. Because I wanted the first one to fix itself with leaning into the cheese more, leaning into the humor just a little bit, enough to understand that like this isn't supposed to be taken deadly seriously. And in retrospect, that movie feels like a laugh riot compared to this one, because this is just it's just borderline superhero garbage, but UFC schlock instead. It's just so weird. What a mess of a film. I'm sure there's other things I wanted to say about this, but I don't need to drag this video out anymore. You've probably already stopped watching because I'm just rambling about it because it's so strange. But anyway, if you haven't and you've made it to the end of this video, then thank you for watching. I make my longest videos about the movies I dislike the most. Anyway, thank you for watching. I've been the Social Solipsist, and I'll see you for something different next time.